Hi, folks. Robert Starmer here. And today we're going to talk about a topic that I think a lot of us are thinking about, and that is how in the world do you manage your cloud costs? And um, to that end, we're really going to look at a number of different topics, um, including uh, things like how do you understand even what your cloud is costing you today, right? How do you actually sort of resolve the disconnect between the cost of cloud and the resources that are being used? I think we have to look at different components there. We also want to understand what's already available, what tools exist to make it easier to discover currently without any additional process or effort, what we might need to do to really understand our cloud costs. Um, and then we can look at a couple of areas where we can investigate how we can get our teams to do better jobs at understanding our cloud costs, including one which is sometimes somewhat controversial, but we'll leave that one, of course, for last. So the first thing we need to do is figure out what does cloud actually cost us and where can we get that information. um, the interesting thing is that in order to really understand our cloud costs and the number of resources within that cloud space, the first thing we almost always have to do is automate our processes. There's going to be a theme through just about everything we ever talk about in terms of cloud is that automation is key. But your deployments, then you have no easy way of adding information, adding metadata. And in most cloud environments, this is called tagging your resources, that we have to do. If we're not tagging our resources, we don't have good tooling for discovering what those resources are being used for. Most cloud deployments, even though they let you do things like name your resources very explicitly, they'll almost always give you an ID, some kind of an identifier. And when they're giving you billing reports or where you're trying to figure out who's doing what you really get is a bunch of IDs and very little information about how those resources were created, why they got created, and why they're now being removed from the environment overall. Well, that's great. I think it's something that we need to consider how we resolve. Um, but the very first thing we have to consider is how do we go about tagging our resources and how do we automate that tagging process? The other thing we can look at is that there are tools. Just about every cloud provider has at least some level of tooling. If nothing else, they're going to give you a bill at the end of the month and they're going to say you've used this much resource. Within that ability to define billing, they can at least tell you you've used this much virtual machine resource, you've used this much containerized resource, you've used this much object storage, you've used our shared databases at this level. But what they really can't give you, is, at least from those default reports, is easily who created that resource, when it was created. Well, they can tell you when it was created and for how long, but not who's been using it, who's been interacting with it, who's sort of creating a lot of that information. And that comes from adding additional observability. Again, the simplest way to add that additional observability, the number one thing is tag all of your resources. So, in order to tag them, though, you have to automate the deployment. You can do this after the fact. You can go in and once a resource has been deployed, you can manually add tags to that resource. But that means that you have to remember to do that after you've deployed your resource. And some people are good enough to do these sorts of things over and over and over again, but most people are not. So we really need to consider how important tagging has become as a way of managing our resources, managing our resource life cycles. Great. The tools that our cloud management platforms provide, for example, Amazon has being the most common cloud, I think most of us are probably looking at Amazon trying to figure out how to manage our Amazon cloud costs. But in any case, they all have some form of discovery tooling. So you can get a bill report, you can break that down by all resources. In some cases, you can learn who it was that actually deployed the resource. So there are ways of using those cost reporting tools. And that's a challenge in and of itself. It does get easier if you have a way of saying, hey, filter this by tags, because those tags are also recorded and captured by the cost management tooling within Amazon, Google, IBM, Oracle, Alibaba, basically you name the cloud provider, and there's likely a way for you to export those tags against resources. Inversely, even if you can't get an explicit reporting from the cloud provider, if you have tagged your resources, then you can do searches against resources and you can learn how long they've been deployed, who deployed them, because the tags should actually have that metadata in them. In other words, that's one of the tags is who deployed it. If it was deployed by a machine, which is a lot of what automation does, right? The automation is triggered by a Git process, for example. So Git source code management process. In those infrastructure as code sorts of environments, often it's not a user that's actually doing it, but it's a user that's requesting it. So you need to make sure that there's a tag being applied all through the automation process that says this is who requested this resource to be created, who committed the change that caused that resource to be created. So the providers driven cloud cost reports are useful in determining what's being spent on what resource, but it's often not quite enough to understand who requested it, why was it actually deployed, why is it still running. And of course, the problem that you have is if you don't know who or why, it's very hard to say, is this a resource that we need to have running? The other part of this is it's hard to say, hey, somebody requested a resource. Was that a resource for development or for test or for production? And if it was a test resource or a development resource, why is it active and continuing to consume budget if it was an automated test that triggered the resource development? Again, automation is really the key to all of this. And if you're not automating your resources, one of the problems we keep running into is tend to have basically extra resource sitting in the environment that isn't being used effectively. Somebody spun up a resource, whether it be a virtual machine or a container, and that container is active and it is consuming cost, but it not being used. And especially in the development world, it's very common for somebody to think, oh, I'm going to try something. So I'm going to spin up a resource and start developing on it, get pulled onto a different task and forget that they spun up that resource. That's the problem with manual cloud management in general, and one of the reasons that automation becomes such a core key feature to all of the management processes. Now, if we can get to the point where we're tagging resources, again, you can use the cloud management tools to get reports and determine based on tags what resources are owned by who. But again, this becomes a manual process. Now I have to pour through these reports or get reports that are specific to a particular resource and say, hey, why are you using these tools? And which of these are things that we can potentially get away with removing at some point? Great. Let's take this one step further. There are management tools, not just the cloud service provider provided tools. They'll tell you what you're spending and how you're spending, don't really have great resources for helping you to manage that spending. One of the tools that we at Cumulus have used in conjunction with some of our customers in the past is a tool called Cloud Custodian, which is now thankfully a part of the CNCF pantheon of tools and available resources. And that's a tool that can help use tags to determine if a resource should continue to run. For example, you can tag things with dates. Good for the next week. Please don't touch, right? And in this way, that tag can be scanned and determined that, oh, as of this date, this resource could be deleted. So if it's still active, I'm just going to get rid of it because it's already been tagged with the right information to say this resource has a short life cycle. There is also the inverse version of that, which is if you've automated all of your resources and all of your delivery, especially in test and development environments, then it's very easy to say, you know what, every Friday night, every Saturday morning, whatever we're going to have an automated process that goes through, and anything that has a tag of development is going to get removed. The idea being that when you come back on Monday morning, you can restart those resources and get back to where you were because you've automated the process of getting to that active state. So again, tagging really drives this. There are tools, again, Cloud Custodian being one. Now, the other factor here, though, is well, how heavily is that resource being used? How much activity is going on that resource? Maybe it's being used just once in a while, but you don't necessarily want it to be deleted just because it's in the development world, because I'm running a long running test and that might be a low impact test or a low utilization test for all I know. So there are other tools that you might want to apply to that custodianization of your application. So basically that tag driven discovery of and management of resources that are active. And so that's where things like Datadog and Sysdig Prometheus, if you're into the Kubernetes system space, start to really become useful. Grafana dashboards and system alerts. This is where you really get into app dynamics, understanding of your application's actual consumption and use in the development, the test, the production environments, even because that's the other area. I don't know how badly my application is being consumed. Do I need more resource? Do I need less resource? We start getting into performance management as a part of cost monitoring as well. Same thing applies. I need to know who deployed it, why was it deployed, what was triggering the deployment, and then in the production space, I need to take this one step further, and I need to start saying to myself, what am I doing? How am I accomplishing an understanding of the costs of my production systems, right? Where it's a little harder to say, I can't just necessarily turn it off. But if I know that it's being underutilized, now I can maybe go back to the development teams and say, hey, you've deployed 200 instances into this particular application. And yes, it is our primary application, but it's being used 10% of it's using 10% of the capacity of those resources. Do we have to have 200 instances running tie into the observability tools that we have with the Datadogs and Systigs, et cetera, and use that information to re-extract and reconnect ourselves back to the actual needs for that application over time. And yes, we want to be able to auto scale if suddenly we do have capacity. Rather than deploying those 200 instances all at once, let's deploy them as the capacity grows or shrinks in an appropriate fashion. So that's a secondary benefit of tagging things, but also adding additional observability into your environment so that it's possible to understand. Heck, even in the developer case, maybe we can go back to the developers and say, hey, can you please not use the largest instance for your development all the time, because you're running that instance all week while you're developing, or maybe even 24/7 while you're developing. But maybe we can turn that off, or maybe you can use a smaller instance so that the runtime cost of your development has been dramatically reduced. I mean, I've seen so many different cases where people are like, okay, well, developers need a certain size instance, right? So you're going to go buy a laptop for somebody, you're going to spec it out at the max. Why? Because it's a one-time purchase, it's a one-time operational cost, and I want to make sure I don't undersize the system and suddenly restrict my developers. Well, once we're in the cloud, we have exactly that same mindset going on. I used to teach a class and using just virtualized resources for deploying applications, and in that class, we gave the students the ability to pick from, I think it was 5 different sizes of instance, from a little tiny test instance, a half a gigabyte of memory and a half core of CPU resource, and a couple of gigabytes of disk space, up to basically an entire physical machine, which at the time was, I think, a 16 core, 64 gig instance. So you could take basically the entire machine as a resource, or you could take a tiny share to test things out with. This was on the first day of class. We hadn't even talked about what we were deploying. We weren't really going to deploy any real application anyway. Every single student would always pick the largest possible instance. And of course, then as soon as you ask them to retrieve that or to release that instance, because this is cloud, so you should be able to add and remove things all the time, it got very frustrating because students were like, no, I don't want to get rid of this one. I'll build another one later for whatever else we're going to do, but I want to keep this one in case I need it for something. We hadn't even done anything. In fact, when we built that class, the students couldn't even log into the instance because they hadn't set their credentials up right, because we hadn't shown them how to do that yet. So it was an absolutely useless resource, but people still did not want to get rid of it. So anyway, the long story short, the key is we really want to be able to right size resources, but that is a secondary factor to cost management. The first factor is, let's make sure we understand what our resources are, how they're being used. If they're not being used or we're not properly identified so that we can't keep track of why they're being used and how they're being used, let's get rid of them. Again, that's where something like a cloud custodian comes in, but that sits on top of the number one most important thing we can do to understand our cloud costs, which is to tag our resources and to automate the process of deploying those resources so that those tags are consistent and always present. Now, we've talked a lot about sort of the infrastructure and the modeling behind this, but let's talk a little bit about what we can do to get our developers into a better state so that they can do this more efficiently and not have to completely relearn how they do their development. So again, number one thing is education. How do we educate our developers and our operators so that they are using the right sets of tools? Education becomes a key to enabling any kind of change in your environment. But education is only so good as the infrastructure that sits around it. And I think the number one thing that we can do to make our education more effective is to add a set of templates for better guidance. Um, so templates are really powerful tools for providing all of the core infrastructure so that developers don't have to try to figure out how to do something. They can be shown in a templated fashion. Here's the base process. Here's where you start. You can take this template and take your default code and drop it into the template. And in many cases, especially in large customers or even in small startup type environments, having a template for your deployment of your backend services, your front end services, even templatizing things like the JavaScript on the website of your application. So basically, the remote execution part of your application. Those are all very useful resources to make sure that you're developing along best practices guidelines. Have a specific model for actually building your environment. It also means that you can build out default test infrastructure, because that's one of the other things that people often forget to automate is their test environment. But again, that's a whole different topic. But still, building out these templates are a part of the education process for your developers and for your operators, because most operators, at least if they come up in sort of the old school way of developing environments, they're used to operating by hand. They look for what's running on the system. They log into the remote environments and start sort of manipulating what's going on there. But if we've automated the deployment of these resources, we should be able to automate the remote operations as well. And again, a template for operating is just as important as a template for developing in these environments. There are some interesting tools that have been coming out over the last number of years. There's the platform as a service systems model. So classically now that would be something like a Heroku or a Cloud Foundry or an OpenShift, I guess would be sort of some of the other environments. And then of course the service providers, the cloud providers themselves have their own things like the cloud apps tools and the um, uh, Lightning and a bunch of these other sorts of tools that are coming from the cloud service providers themselves. There are lots of these models, and most of them are built around the idea of building a web app against some kind of a data store, which really does look like 90% of most application development these days. So having either a portal that embeds these templates and provides a guidable path for developers to get started on developing a new application, and or having just a set of standards, even if you don't necessarily have a specific portal defined, but having a documented set of standards for how to go about building, testing, deploying, and managing the life cycle of your resources is a huge benefit to getting to more accurate cloud management. Now, we're talking about cost management. We're talking about how we save money in the cloud, and one of the things that often people sort of shy away from, but I think is really critical for making this viable, is looking at the idea of chargeback. Now, most people say, "Oh, this is going to get so complicated. How am I going to deal with money inside my organization and defining chargeback and costs and et cetera?" And it's not so much that you have to deal with actual money. In a sense, it's almost like you can give people a use budget, which is not a restriction. It's just a target to work towards. Or rather, you can just charge people against that and say, "Hey, look, you used X amount of resource. Now, as long as you can justify that resource, which is often very straightforward to do, I got a product out and I use this much resource, that's one thing. But really, chargeback is more about showing the costs of the infrastructure and the resources. And so when a development manager goes in and says, "Hey, I need more developers because I'm trying to do more work, but I need more people to do that work," at least you have a way of saying, "Yes, you can do that." But we need you to look at the costs of what your current work process looks like, and especially if you can compare that to others. A comparison model is probably one of the key things that makes chargeback really useful, or even show back, I guess, is the other way that people talk about it, is a way of saying I'm not charging you anything, but I'm going to show you what your resources cost. And I need you to understand that if you're coming to me and costing 10 times as much to do your application development as your peers, there's something wrong. And maybe we need to figure out why that is, because we're all trying to be financially responsible to our organizations. But how do you do that if you don't have any kind of connection to the actual costs that are being incurred as you're using cloud resources? Now, another reason that I think this becomes maybe a little bit of a difficult subject for some is that often cloud resources, especially for startups, are free for a period of time. So they'll get $300,000 of equivalent cloud cost for free for the first 2 years. And many small startups, $300,000 basically covers their cloud costs for probably 4 or 5 years. Now, maybe there's probably usually a time limit on that as well. But in those first couple of years, if you haven't actually gotten to the point of having enough credit to build your application and get to a potentially revenue driven process, I think people are often starting to think, well, is this really a business that you want to be in or not? But we're seeing that whole concept of chargeback become really critical to managing, or showback rather, be managing the timeline and the life cycle of cloud cost. These things do sort of go hand in hand, and it helps your developers understand how they are impacting their business and the potential future of the company by their actions. For automating things, if we're discovering things via tagging, we can have those conversations. It's a much easier to show somebody chargeback if you say, your organization, your team, in fact, this engineer was the most expensive engineer across the company in terms of costs, and managing that life cycle is really a large part of that. So we've talked about a number of different topics. We've talked about how we can understand our costs. That's driven primarily by tagging. We've talked a little bit about some of the tooling that might be available to us, both tooling from our cloud vendors and from third-party tools, either additional observability like a Datadog, Sysdig, Aptly, etc., or some of the open source tools, Cloud Custodian being the one that I've got in the past. As long as I have tagging available, or basically metadata that I can consume and extract to understand my cloud costs, I can find or I do find rather, that in fact I can get a lot of information from that. So I can tag things, I can automate the deployments so that I get consistent and accurate tagging for my resources. I can use tools to both discover based on those tags what things are costing. I can also use those tools to manage resources and remove resources if they're not properly tagged so that I can't track them properly. I can also help my developers get a better handle on this process through templatization, through education, and through portals and or standards and ways of actually doing that development process and driving those automated tags into the system for all the different stages of development. And lastly, I really do think that it's important that we look at adding chargeback or showback type information. Once I've tagged it, I can actually do that on a very granular basis to help our teams understand how they're actually impacting the financial value of our business. So that's hopefully enough to get you started in thinking about how you might want to go about cloud computing and cloud cost management. Of course, Cumulus Technologies is here to help you at any time if you would like help in sort of implementing or developing these sorts of programs. That's really what we do for people, is to help them understand how they're managing infrastructure, how they're managing their deployments, and how they're automating these processes from beginning to end. Again, this has been Robert Starmer, and thanks again for your time.